On the night of April 12, 1861, artillery fire tore across the harbor in Charleston, South Carolina, hammering a federal outpost called Fort Sumter. The men firing those cannons and the men hunkering inside the fort shared the same ancestry. They spoke the same language, prayed to the same God, and up until that exact moment, they were citizens of the same nation.
City of the ghost looking back at the war. The Civil War. We don't talk it out, we just walk it out. The Civil War. Got the block in a choke, what they talk about. The Civil War. Yeah, the money is the motive, we don't doubt it now. The Civil War. Let the city burning, turning the lights out. Civil War.
This bombardment followed 40 years of failed political compromises and escalating regional hostility. The firing on Sumter served as the explosive conclusion to a long-running socio-economic war over the survival of human slavery. To understand how the country reached the point of turning guns on itself, we have to rewind from 1861 and look at the economic engines driving the country. Down south, the entire social and economic framework rested on agriculture. Huge amounts of capital were tied up in the production of cotton, a highly lucrative cash crop powered entirely by the brutal, legally protected institution of chattel slavery. This map shows how the United States was effectively split in two. While the South relied on massive plantations and enslaved labor, the North was rapidly industrializing. Its cities were expanding with factories and commercial services built around a free labor market. As the United States kept expanding westward, these two incompatible systems were forced to compete. Every time a new territory was added, politicians battled over whether it would enter the Union as a slaveholding state or a free state, desperately trying to maintain political balance in Washington. With a finite amount of land and political power to go around, keeping these two diametrically opposed economies balanced under one government eventually became mathematically and politically impossible. That fragile balance finally broke with the 1860 presidential election of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln won the election on a very specific platform. He did not initially campaign to abolish slavery where it already existed, but he firmly opposed allowing it to spread into any new U.S. territories. By containing it, his strategy was to put the institution on a path to eventual extinction. The Southern political elite saw this policy as a direct threat to their way of life and their economy. Before Lincoln even took office, 7 Deep South states decided to secede, formally withdrawing from the United States to create their own separate government, the Confederacy. Long after the war, a myth developed that these states left over a dispute regarding states' rights, but the seceding states themselves made their motivations clear in their own official documents. Mississippi's Declaration of Secession explicitly stated, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery." Newspapers printed broadsides declaring the Union dissolved. The legal and social framework of the country was tearing apart in real time. By attempting to leave the Union, the Southern states demonstrated they were willing to tear down the American Republic rather than accept a future where slavery was contained. All of that political tensions shattered the moment the cannons fired on Fort Sumter. The United States government, now led by Lincoln, refused to relinquish its forts located in territory claimed by the new Confederacy. By holding their ground, they forced the Southern forces to make the first military strike. Losing the fort to an armed bombardment shocked the Northern public. The attack erased any lingering apathy and ignited a massive wave of pro-Union patriotism. 3 days later, Lincoln issued a proclamation calling on the states to provide 75,000 militiamen to march south and recapture the federal property. That call for troops erased the last bit of middle ground. Faced with orders to march against their southern neighbors, states in the Upper South, like Virginia and Tennessee, immediately seceded and joined the Confederacy. Fort Sumter was the inevitable detonation point for a nation that could no longer reconcile its opposing halves. The very first shells ended the era of political maneuvering and officially began the deadliest conflict in American history. In the brutal winter of 1863, the Union Army was stalled in the mud. Soldiers were freezing, exhausted by years of heavy casualties, and openly questioning why they were even fighting this war. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1st, added a new moral directive to the conflict, but on the front lines, it landed like a lead weight. Reading through this lengthy military order, the troops quickly realized a glaring logistical problem. The edict only applied to territories actively in rebellion, places where the federal government currently had zero actual authority. Without conquering the land, the words were essentially unenforceable. The reaction in the camps was overwhelmingly negative. Take the Michigan regiments, for example. Many of these men had signed up strictly to preserve the Union as it existed before the war. They openly complained in letters home that they were being asked to risk their lives for abolition, a cause they hadn't agreed to fight for. This deep ideological divide tore through the ranks. Desertion spiked as disgruntled soldiers packed up and went home, dragging Northern military and civilian morale to its lowest point yet. Lincoln's attempt to give the war a higher purpose was threatening to dissolve his own army from within. If the administration wanted this policy to survive the winter, they desperately needed victories on the battlefield to validate it. By the summer, General Ulysses S. Grant was executing a strategy to physically slice the Confederacy in half. This map shows the Anaconda Plan in action. The Northern strategy required total control of the Mississippi River to strangle Southern commerce. But there was one final, heavily fortified bottleneck blocking the Union: the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Lincoln obsessed over this specific geography. He argued that the rebellion could defy the North indefinitely from this position, using it to funnel what he called hog and hominy, unlimited food and fresh troops from the far west directly into the main Confederate armies. After multiple failed frontal assaults against the city's steep bluffs, Grant decided to starve the defenders out. He dug in for a grueling 40-day siege. Slowly, his forces choked off the city, trapping the Confederate garrison inside with rampant disease and dwindling rations. On July 4, 1863, the starving defenders finally surrendered. In a single stroke, Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana were completely severed from the Southern war machine. With Vicksburg secured, the entire Mississippi River became a federally controlled highway, permanently crippling the South's logistical lifeblood. But while Grant was advancing in the West, the Union faced a massive crisis in the East. General Robert E. Lee had marched his Army of Northern Virginia straight into Pennsylvania. Lee knew Northern morale was hanging by a thread. His objective was to crush a Union army on its own soil, panic the civilian population, and force Washington to the negotiating table. The two massive armies collided at the crossroads town of Gettysburg. What followed was a desperate 3-day struggle as federal troops tried to repel the largest Northern invasion of the entire conflict. The breaking point came on the 3rd day. Lee ordered a massive frontal assault against the fortified center of the Union line. It was a disaster. The advancing Confederates were cut down, resulting in staggering casualties that the South simply did not have the population to replace. This map timeline highlights an incredible historical convergence. Lee began his grueling retreat back to Virginia on the exact same day, July 4, 1863, that Vicksburg formally surrendered to Grant. Within a single 24-hour window, the Confederacy lost its geographic cohesion in the West, while its most feared army suffered a catastrophic defeat in the East. As the results reached the camps, the atmosphere shifted. The same men who had been writing of despair and fatal division only months earlier began reporting a tangible sense of momentum. By September, Lincoln could finally say that peace no longer appeared so distant. As these rejuvenated armies marched deeper into Confederate territory, white troops came face to face with the daily realities of plantation slavery. Observing the system up close stripped away their previous indifference, with many soldiers noting in their diaries that the institution was a cancer embedded in the nation. At the same time, the practical benefits of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation became undeniable. African American men were rapidly enlisting, pouring much-needed fresh manpower into the depleted federal ranks, eventually making up nearly 10% of the entire army. Every enslaved person who fled to a Union camp or picked up a federal rifle served a powerful dual purpose. They strengthened the Northern military while directly stripping the Southern economy of the captive labor force that relied on to sustain its war effort. The letters from the front changed. Soldiers who once viewed the proclamation as a distraction began to subscribe to it as a necessary war measure. They saw that by attacking the institution of slavery, they were delivering a blow from which the rebellion could not recover. By the end of 1863, the military and social goals of the war had merged. For the rank and file, the successes of that summer demonstrated that the survival of the Union was now inextricably linked to the dismantling of the institution that had sparked the rebellion. By April 1865, the Confederate capital of Richmond lay in ruins. 4 years of warfare had hollowed out the South, and the military conflict was finally gasping its last breath. On April 9th, General Robert E. Lee formally surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant. While this didn't trigger an instant nationwide ceasefire, it severed the head of the Confederate military. News of Lee's defeat triggered a sequential collapse. Over the next few weeks, remaining Confederate departments folded one by one, leading to a total military surrender by the end of the year. With the guns silenced, the physical enforcement of slavery evaporated. Through the passage of the 13th Amendment, 3.5 million enslaved people were officially liberated, effectively ending the labor system that had defined the Southern economy for generations. But just 5 days after Lee's surrender, the focus shifted to Washington. President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, removing the man who had spent 2 years planning the nation's reintegration. The end of the fighting left the United States with the task of reintegrating 11 states and millions of newly freed citizens, all while navigating the sudden death of the president. While the South was devastated, the northern states were experiencing a massive industrial boom. The logistical demands of the war effort had forced northern factories and farms to adopt new technologies at an accelerated pace. To move troops and supplies, the federal government rapidly expanded the United States military railroads. By 1865, the North possessed the world's largest railroad system, which provided a massive head start in developing national infrastructure. Even agriculture surged. With half the northern men away at war, those left behind relied on mechanized farming tools like horse-drawn planters and reapers. Crop yields actually increased despite the labor shortage. Funding this effort required a total financial overhaul. Congress implemented the first federal income tax and authorized paper greenbacks, replacing thousands of fragmented local banknotes with a single unified federal currency. By 1865, the North had evolved from a loose collection of local markets into a centralized industrial state, capable of funding and moving resources on a scale that was impossible just 5 years earlier. South of the Mason-Dixon line, the reality was the opposite. The Union Army had obliterated Southern railroads and factories, and the abolition of slavery dismantled the region's entire economic foundation. This chart tracks the purchasing power of the Confederate dollar, which plunges until hitting absolute zero in 1865. This collapse wiped out regional wealth and forced civilians to rely on a primitive barter system just to obtain food. With no cash and limited options, a new system emerged: sharecropping. Newly freed Black Americans rented plots from former plantation owners, paying for them with a portion of their harvest. This often kept families tied to the land in deep poverty, rather than granting them property ownership. By the late 1860s, the United States was composed of two entirely distinct economic systems, forced back into one political union. Navigating a peace under these conditions proved to be a difficult task. Abraham Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, took a lenient approach to reintegrating the South. He allowed Southern states to manage their own transitions, which they used to pass Black Codes, laws designed to restrict the movement and labor of African Americans. This led to a clash with the radical Republicans in Congress, like Thaddeus Stevens. They eventually took control of policy, dividing the South into military districts and using federal troops to enforce civil rights. With military backing, Congress moved to rewrite the country's legal foundations. They passed the 14th Amendment, establishing national birthright citizenship and equal protection, and the 15th Amendment, which barred the denial of voting rights based on race. These federal protections changed the political landscape. Across the South, African Americans began winning elections, including Hiram Revels of Mississippi, who became the first African American to serve in the United States Senate. For a brief window, federal troops ensured these legal changes were enforced, creating an environment where Black Americans could exercise their new rights and hold public office for the first time. But this progress faced a violent backlash. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan used terrorism and intimidation to suppress Black political participation, working alongside Southern Democrats to undermine federal policies. At the same time, the Supreme Court began to limit federal authority. A series of rulings weakened the government's ability to protect citizens from state-level discrimination, shifting power back to local Southern legislatures. By 1877, federal troops were withdrawn from the South as part of a political compromise. With the military gone, the gate slammed shut on Black civil rights, and Southern states began to entrench decades of Jim Crow segregation laws. The Confederate surrender in 1865 preserved the Union and expanded the reach of the federal government. But the eventual collapse of Reconstruction meant that the legal equality established during the war would take another century to realize.
In the city of the ghost, looking back at the wall.